Croeso I bawb, y bore 'ma. Thank you for joining us today. I can see the numbers creeping up, which is nice. So some will be joining us online. I've had a run through of the participant list from Charlotte, and there are a lot of names and faces that I know. So welcome back to those of you who've heard previous presentations from me, either face-to-face or online. I hope it won't be too repetitive, but where there are some things that we've covered previously, it's an opportunity for you to dig deeper yourself into some of the questions that arise from those. But I've also taken the opportunity to introduce some new thinking, and the purpose of this morning, as I share my screen, will be to look at this. Leading professional learning, moving from inset towards effective PL. Right, let me just double check. Is the screen share okay? So we're okay, good, thanks. I've highlighted 3 words on there because I want to focus on these. The first is on leading professional learning. So this is not a lecture. It is not a training session. It is about talking with leaders from all sectors, leaders from all types of institution and organization, and leaders from Wales. But some of the points that I'll be raising are global points. They're international, and professional learning is certainly an international concept that we can parallel elsewhere. And many of you, I know through the Academy, have had contacts internationally, and we need to draw on that experience to take ourselves forward. I've highlighted the second one, moving from inset. I want to do that deliberately because in the vocabulary, and those of you who've heard me speak before know, I don't have a hang up with terminology, but we'll come on to this in a minute. But I do like to make sure we're on the same page when the words we're using are specific. So I want to look at the way in which we move from inset, which is a term we all use, and looking at the Hub website, looking at other sites and documents from our Welsh Government and elsewhere. Inset is still in common usage. We have inset days. So how can we move? Do we need to move from inset towards effective PL? I put effective in inverted commas because I just want to throw a couple of pebbles in the pond just to raise some questions about how we might look at, is the professional learning we engage in effective? How can we look at that? And some of those questions are for you to answer, but I want to raise the questions this morning. So we want to look at leading professional learning, moving from inset towards effective PL. The 2 documents I want to draw attention to this morning are the first one, which Tegwen's mentioned. That's already in print or online, and that's leading professional learning. That's the insight document. Now, if you want to drill deeper into some of the things, a lot of the things I'm going to mention this morning, please do look at that. It's interesting that nobody's mentioned on the book day this morning. Nobody's come in bringing that under their arms and saying, hey, right, okay, this is my book. I'm going to dress up as Ken Jones. So please don't. But do have a look at that to drill down on some of the points that are being mentioned. The second one, and this is forthcoming, is that for Welsh Government Leadership Academy, I've written a second insight document called on leading professional learning, building professional learning capacity, a leadership perspective. And I've taken this as the source of just working through some of the questions and the points I want to ask a little later on. So that's forthcoming. Keep an eye open for it. And I hope when you look at it, you'll find it stimulating and also informative. Okay, let's have a look. The easy bit, so we've got a new curriculum. We've got a new curriculum in schools, in organizations, and I know there's post-16 organizations and other organizations here. That's change. It's part of a change that we're all going through. For the new curriculum, the easy bit was designing the new curriculum. The difficult bit is getting involved in making it work. That's a challenge, because if we try to get everybody involved in making it work, which we must do now because we're committed to it in different ways, but we're committed to it, that's the difficult bit. The really challenging bit is getting it to work coherently and consistently in every classroom and in every learning environment. That's key. It's key for equity, because if we don't become consistent, and that is without saying this is what we all must do in a uniform way, but we must be consistent so that we're equitable in what our students and what our learners actually experience. And the key to that is partly the professional learning provision that we're engaging in. But for me, and for us in this room, in this virtual room, it is how we lead that. And that's what I want to focus on this morning. So how can we lead professional learning so that we hit the really challenging bit of getting it to work closely and consistently and coherently in every learning environment? Okay, as I said, let's just go back on the terminology to make sure we're on the same page. We still use the term INSET. There's no problem in that whatsoever. INSET refers, it's an acronym which means in-service education and training. Now, people often miss the E as education out. It is vitally important, because if we're looking at INSET, we need that E to be a capital E, in-service education and training, not just a small e, in-service training. So apologies for going back over that, but it is important. And there is a difference then between training and professional development, or CPD. The training, I've had this morning and during the week. I got a new computer, got an Apple. My brother-in-law, who's a photographer, convinced me that Apple was the bee's knees and therefore I must get one. And having spent, I don't know how many years with Microsoft and then more recently with Android, I now have to learn how to use an Apple. And I wouldn't be here this morning without Charlotte, who was absolutely brilliant in taking me through a training program on Tuesday morning. She wasn't expecting it. And I said, let's run through, Charlotte. And it's even from, where are the keys on this? And I want to be in PowerPoint. I don't want to be in Keynote. Thank you very much. So Charlotte was brilliant. And it really, again, brought home for me the training that's needed to actually develop skills and to get things right. So if it all goes wrong this morning, you know who to blame. So training in that sense, training focuses the mind. Education broadens the mind. And if we want training, yes, we must have it. And there are clear outcomes that we can work towards. Education and professional development actually begins to broaden the mind. Professional learning is broader again. So when we're using the term, and this is really what I'm coming around to, when we're talking about professional learning, we're talking about the huge variety of ways in which we learn, in the same as our learners when we're in our organizations, that our learners actually go through a lot of learning experiences. You're doing it now. You're listening to me. And many of you are doing lots of different things while listening to me. But I hope, but you'll be learning in some shape or form afterwards. It's not training. It's not training, not telling you how to do what you do with, and I can't guess what you're going to go away with afterwards. But I hope, well, I know that there will be some form of learning involved. Okay, and if you want more on that, again, just log on to EWC, and in the EWC SON blogs, there's a series of blogs there. You'll find that from 2015. It was interesting because I had a look at this just before coming online, and this was written in 2015. It's still relevant, I think, but it refers to the New Deal. Do you remember the New Deal? The New Deal was the New Deal, which was coming through and was going to introduce this new way of looking at professional learning in Wales. So do have a look at that. It's interesting historically, but it also begins to explain what is the difference between professional learning and professional development. Okay, have we moved on? Have we moved on from inset, goodness me, a term that was used in the 1970s, to where we are now in terms of professional learning and in terms of leading professional learning? Have we moved on? I've just done an editorial, it's just a short plug here really for the journal Professional Development in Education, which some of you will know. And we've just come into our 50th year. We started in 1974. It's interesting that if you were in the 1970s, you were actually probably in your mid-20s. And now in the mid-20s, those people are in their mid-70s. Funny on the way numbers work. One of the things we did to go back is to look at 50 years of professional development. And we tracked it back from the term inset right the way up to the present time, professional learning. That's free to access. A lot of it is about the journal, but if you're interested in going back and looking and see how it's evolved, then that is, you might find that interesting. But what did we find? Let's have a look, because this actually begins to map out our own journeys, I think, both as organizations and as individuals. So during those 50 years, the terminology has changed from management, it's changed to leadership. So we're no longer managing staff development. We are now leading professional learning. That's important because it means something different. So everyone in this webinar this morning is engaged in leading professional learning. And that means a lot more than managing staff development. The reason for raising that so importantly is if we come back to inset and we look at the way in which we manage inset days or manage inset activities, that's quite a narrow way of looking at it. So we do need to broaden out a little more. We've come from action research to practitioner inquiry. We've got NPEP, we've got actually schools and other organizations looking critically at their practice and doing some fantastic work in taking that forward. Our accreditations move forward. In the 70s, we'd only just entered into an all-graduate profession. And now we've moved through, we've got national masters and many, many more are actually following EdD programs. So we may even have an all-masters profession and an all-doctorate profession at some point, or certainly more. Collaboration and networking have improved from isolation. And we talked about PLCs and PLNs, professional learning networks, now becoming the norm rather than the exception. Induction, we've moved from probationers with a checklist of what they had to do to actually continue in teaching to the way in which NQTs work and the mentoring and coaching that ties in with those. And in terms of policy, huge changes, perhaps too many changes. But we've moved from TRIST and GRIST in the 1980s. Most of you probably weren't born then, right the way up through to NAPL and NPLE. And you know what those are about. Go on to Hub, look up NAPL, look up NPLE. I've stopped making assumptions that people know what the national approach to professional learning in Wales is and what the national professional learning entitlement in Wales is. But as leaders, you probably need to have, or you do need to have, just an outline understanding, if not deeper, if you're interested in professional learning, an outline understanding of what those two policy changes are in Wales and how they're developing. And Hub gives you a huge amount of information which can lead you through to that. Okay, so that's where we've been. Where are we going? And that's important for leaders. Do you buy into these? Because if we're looking at future-facing professional learning, we need to begin to be looking forward. The growth of digital technologies, absolutely essential. You're working on these. Close to practice professional learning. To what extent is our professional learning close to practice? Or is it closer to policy? Or are we looking at the way in which policies actually do begin to impact on practice? We're looking at effectiveness. What does it mean to have effective professional learning? We need to look at leadership in complex environments. I'll come on to that in a second. And one of the things which I think we need to do if we really are future facing is to move from reproductive professional development to transformative professional learning. In other words, reproductive professional development is actually saying, let's have a look at what we've got to do today, and this is how we should do it. Transformative professional learning is actually saying, okay, what's going to hit us tomorrow? And how might we lead into it and begin to predict, if you like, what we need, where we need to be going? So the question was, have we moved on? Answer, absolutely, definitely, yes. We've made huge strides both in education, both in teaching and learning, and in professional learning. But there's still a need for greater consistency, because have we moved on? Well, yes, many of us have actually moved on and are well ahead of the game, but not everyone. And there's a need for greater consistency. Now, you may also need to ask that of your own staff teams. To what extent do we have consistency in the way in which we understand how we need to take our learning forward? Okay, can I try these out on you? The first one is, if we look back at systems and look at the ways in which systems have actually moved forward to take their professional learning forward. I've put this in not because this is what we do, but if you look back over 50 years, you can track these steps and these changes that have taken place. Now, you may say, no, that's not right. And also, the steps aren't, everybody has to go through these steps, or everybody did go through these steps. There are lots of ways of looking at it, and lots of points that you can come in, and lots of places where you revisit some of the steps as well. But let me have a look. Let's see if you can identify with this. Maybe you can't. But we began with a laissez-faire approach. And it's ad hoc. Individual schools, teachers operate in an uncoordinated way. If you go back to the 70s where this all began, that was actually the case. There was very little in terms of saying, right, this is how we're going to shape ourselves as professional learners. If you look at a number of other countries in the world, they're still in that position. So in other words, there's total professional autonomy. Professionals should know what to do. You get on with it. We don't have to tell you what to do. So it's laissez-faire. Then we get sector leaders beginning to emerge. Individual schools or teachers emerge as leading players in the system. And people say, oh, look what's happening over there. That's interesting. So we get leaders within each sector or within each area or within each region, and people begin to take notice. Then we move into an intervention stage. This is interesting for leaders because at this point, there's either national or regional intervention to establish policy. So somebody somewhere says, we can't allow things to go forward ad hoc. We need to bring it together, and we need to take things forward. We need to take professionals forward in this way if we're to achieve what we want to achieve. Then we hit takeoff with professional learning, professional development. Takeoff is where we then have national guidelines. We've got policy. We've got active self-generated networking taking place. So within those steps, you now have schools, organizations, post-16 organizations, professionals actually beginning to work as independent learners until you end up at a stage 5, which I call sustainable systemic adoption. In other words, there's high interaction and impact. The renewal of professional learning is actually locally instigated. You don't need to direct it. There doesn't need to be firm, strong policy because it's working. It's working at local level. Somebody once said one of the key purposes of teaching is to enable people to get by without teachers. Because if we're so reliant on teaching, if we're so reliant on policy, then we're not taking our profession and our learners forward. So we have to have that level of autonomy. Now, if you take this down to the next level, and this is where I want to know at some point, do you buy into this or not? Did this happen in your experience? So we had laissez-faire at the beginning, we had closed-door teaching. That goes back a while. So is there any laissez-faire approach to professional learning now? Probably not. Then we have the emergence of sector leaders. So individual teachers or teams began to emerge as leading players. Others take notice. Then we had intervention. That's where the senior leadership team of an organization or school, institution actually begins to set out its own priorities. Now that actually did come quite later in the history, but it's actually there now where there is institution-focused priorities, staff development, professional learning plans, and so on, came through performance management, and sessions are directed and transmissive. This is what you're going to do. Then we hit takeoff as organizations. In other words, teacher leadership emerges strongly. You get practitioner inquiry, which is purposeful, not just going through the motions. There's active self-generated networking. So people talk to each other without being directed to say, right, you will talk to them. There's actually networking going on until you hit level 5, sustainable systemic adoption. That means within your organization, there's high interaction and impact. High interaction. So in other words, people again aren't directed to interact, they just do it naturally. Professional learning is non-directed. It actually begins to take place and drives the organization forward in a critical way, but in a positive and constructive way. Do you buy into that? Do you say, no, that doesn't conform with reality? And maybe from stage 5, you then go back to stage 3, because there's policy coming in. And at points, certain points, you have to look at policy and say, we have to drive this forward. So do these steps align with your experience? Can you track back your own experience to that? Where would you place your organization or your team? Are you anywhere close to what step 5, which is high interaction and impact? If you are you all there? Don't mean all of you in this virtual room. I mean all of you as staff and as colleagues in your organizations. So there are some questions there. If you don't buy into the model, that's absolutely fine. But how can we get to high interaction and impact in terms of professional learning? Okay, I've used that word impact a couple of times. And there's another one, effectiveness. Can I just look at these two terms critically at the moment? If we look at ESTIN, the ESTIN supplementary guidance, evaluating the quality and impact of professional learning, it's really worth looking at. And the supplementary guidance is worth reading. Again, not so much for the book day, but put your feet up and read through it. You've probably been through it in detail. You probably know it inside out. But there's some of the points here that ESTIN raised, which are quite, which are good and constructive and positive. They use the SLO model to support their approach to professional learning. Presumably, you're all aware what the SLO model is. You're aware of the components. You look at each of them. You've gone through it. You've planned. Just maybe you haven't. Maybe you haven't, but it's certainly something that perhaps needs to be looked at. And when ESTIN say that you need to use the SLO model to support your approach to professional learning, that should direct you to look at the schools learning organizations model. And within there's good advice. They engage professional learning, engage all staff in purposeful activities. Fine. Are your inset activities purposeful, or are they just transmissive? We have to look at this new policy. Here it is. To what extent is that purposeful? Questions? But for you to actually toy through and work through to look at some of these words. To what extent do you identify good practice within your provider, within your organization, so other staff may benefit from it? Yep, probably do identify good practice. Or to what extent, let's put that on its head, is good practice invisible? To what extent is it visible to others? To what extent, if we're looking at step 5 in that model, do others gravitate towards where the good practice is and say, oh, okay, yeah, hey, I can actually use some of that. Let's have a cup of coffee and take me through where you're at. To what extent are you collaborating with other schools providers? This is where the professional learning network comes in to develop professional practice. There's collaboration and there's collaboration. There's contrived collaboration where people actually meet, go through, it's quite nice. Then there's collaboration, which is critical collaboration, which says, okay, you stand back, you're not in my organization, you stand back, have a look at what I'm doing. What do you think? Have a look critically. How can I take it forward? And then lastly, STIMs say, monitor a good organization, effective organization, monitors the impact of professional learning on the effectiveness, leadership, and learners' progress and well-being. Absolutely essential. It's important that the effectiveness of professional learning on learners is understood and begins to become made explicit, and well-being is central to that. Well-being not only of the learner, well, of all learners, including professional learners. Okay, so that's where STIN are. We can look at a large number. If you look at the insight document that I've done for the Academy, it goes through there a lot of research which actually pick up some of the key elements of well-led and effective professional learning, including, and I'm not going to go into this in detail this morning, including the hallmarks, which are the Academy's way of looking at characteristics of well-led professional learning. Now, they're not criteria, it's not a checklist, but they are hallmarks. And they look at, if you have well-led professional learning, what are the key elements that might emerge from that? So do have a look at the insight document and pick up some of the points that are coming through there. Okay, one of the problems is we can define and design our inset as a linear model. In other words, we design the inset, we then deliver it, and then the participants in that, our colleagues, go back to their learning environments and they enact it. And then we evaluate it and we say, right, did we get it right? How good was that inset? How good was that professional development? And you have inputs and outcomes. So what we want from that inset day, what we want from that inset activity will be this. Did we get it? And that will give us a clue then to how effective that inset day or that inset activity was. That's a linear model. You can probably tell by my tone that that's probably we've moved on from that model. We have moved on from that model. So instead of looking at linear models and the way in which a design or inset can be effective, we need to look a little bit more at that term effective PLD. And one of the ways we can do it is look at research. And we can say, well, research shows that effective professional learning and development has these characteristics. All right, let me just pick up an article published recently. It's published in that volume of the journal that I put on the screen a little while ago. And that's by Astrahan and Lefstein. They say policymakers appreciate simple answers to complex questions. That's a fact of life. If you're standing up in Parliament or Senedd and you have to answer a question, you want a simple answer. So they're looking for simple answers. In the field of professional learning, professional development in this case, the research community has tended to oblige them. So we give them simple answers to complex questions. What they say is specifically, educational researchers have been producing lists of the core features of effective professional development design for over a quarter of a century. We can go back to Laura Desimone stuff. I could list them, and many of them are actually listed also in the Insight document. Can I just say at this point, it's absolutely important that we look at those and that we try and get as close to those lists as possible. But they say gravitational forces, probably political forces, appear to be pulling the field to identify effective features and to present them with greater confidence than the evidence warrants. So what they do, they say, okay, hang on, before we say research shows that, we need to look a little bit more critically at the research and to see whether that research really does show that. Because what we have is complex dynamic systems. We can talk about complicated systems. Paul Jess talks about a television. A television is a complicated system. I don't understand how a TV works, but I switch it on and it comes on. Or my computer for that matter. I switch it on and it comes on. What we're working with in education are complex systems. So the components interact with one another, but they change with different conditions. They change with teachers' attitudes. So we can design an inset or a professional development. Have a think back to your last 3 inset days, 3 inset activities, 3 professional development activities that you've been on. And what was the gap between the design and then the delivery? I don't like the word delivery, but it means the process, the session. And then enact means the participants go away and they work on what they've just done in the inset activity. And you'll find there's more than one arrow coming out of the enact box. So we have a large number of ways of looking at what is quite a simple design process. OECD brought this up. They talked about in Wales when they did the last report on Wales. And they said stakeholders also often make sense of the same policy messages in different ways. And this can largely affect implementation. This is where the leadership comes in. So we've got policy, we can design inset to actually make sure that people understand and work to the policy. And then from that, people actually take the same message but do it in different ways. It's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, that's one of the type characteristics of good professionalism. But what we've got, if we're designing professional learning provision or designing professional development, we've got something like this. We've got what is intended, and then we've got filters, because what we intend to do gets hit by structural barriers. That might be timetabling, it might be the school day, it might be who's participating, who isn't participating. So then it goes through that filter until you come to receive. What do those people receive? And how much of that do they agree with? So you've actually then got filters, and the amount of the professional development which people ignore and people buy into is actually much less than what you intended when you planned it. And then they go away and they apply it. And that's even lower then, until you come down to student or learner impacts, and that is quite narrow. So the filter between what you intended to do and the impact on the students, there's quite a few barriers that come in between. And what I wanted you to do as leaders was begin to look at those barriers and to ask questions about how you can begin to reduce the barriers so that the gap between intended professional development and professional learning and student impact or learner impact is actually narrowed. So nothing changes if nothing changes, and improvement is not doing the same better. It's actually transforming and looking at new ways of doing things. So the implications then are for you as leaders of professional learning to actually make that transformation. Okay, the next section briefly, I just want to touch very, very briefly on this, is the forthcoming insight document. And that's on building professional learning capacity. And I've split it down to 5 themes: what works, professional learning and the individual, who does the leading, identifying obstacles, which we've just looked at, and then complexity. So keep your eyes open for this, because these themes are just looked at and addressed in that next document. Very quickly, what works? To what extent is professional learning identified as planned activities rather than with informal leadership opportunities? Not all PL leads immediately to improved learner outcomes. Does that matter? And the word there is immediately. To what extent is the professional learning that you lead active? To what extent is it passive? Think about inset days. Go back to your last 3. How much of those were transmissive with a passive audience rather than active with a professionally critical audience, your colleagues? And where the professional learning focuses on improved learner outcomes, how can you measure that impact? And I put 2 keywords at the top: communicate and blend. Communicate means that as leaders, and I'm not talking about individual leaders, I'm talking about leaders as teams, there needs to be a communication which says, what did you do in school today? To actually develop that deeper thinking. And blend, there's not one single way of working towards professional learning. The second one is PL and the individual, and aggregation. We aggregate, we all aggregate. We've got a number of learners in our learning group. We aggregate that to the class. So we end up talking about the class. The individual has to move to one background side. The class, we aggregate to talk about schools. And worse, for PISA, we aggregate schools to talk about countries. It annoys me when people say, well, why is China doing so well? So we have to disaggregate, and we have to look at and think about individuals. Do you aggregate with your colleagues when you talk about professional learning, when you run and design inset or professional development activities? How much variability is there across your staff group? And who are your highly accomplished teachers? Do we patronize them sometimes in the way in which we design our professional learning support? To what extent can we use them to actually guide us forward? And then lastly, who does the leading? Who does it? Do you have a frozen system? Who is responsible for taking professional learning forward in your school? And are they using the term professional learning in the same way as we might be using it? Okay, so the conclusion is for you to drill down more critically to look at what works for us, what doesn't work, and why. So we've got 4 questions to ask. What works for you in terms of inset, professional development, professional learning? What doesn't work for you in terms of inset, professional development, professional learning? Let's have a look at the what doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? And then how can we move towards making it work? So in your breakout groups, perhaps have a think about what the questions that I've asked this morning, but more significantly, think back on your recent inset activities. I'm using inset deliberately now, and then ask yourself those questions. What worked? What didn't work? Why didn't it work? And how can we move towards making it work? Hire Rembrandt to do the painting, but don't tell him how to paint. It's coming back to the highly accomplished teachers and highly accomplished educators on your teams. Diolch yn fawr.